Welcome, everyone. I'm Yvonne Schwab, ACG Silicon Valley CEO. Thank you for joining us today for our M&A Circle discussion. If you are new to ACG Silicon Valley, we are the leading business-to-business networking organization, providing connections, thought leadership, and enabling personal and organizational growth. ACGSV offers an array of networking opportunities with over 13,000 members in 59 chapters across the world. ACG provides local connections with a global reach. Now, we are so excited to start offering face-to-face events again. On the 24th of March, we will have a networking happy hour at Ludwig's in Mountain View. It's a beer garden, so it will be outside. Please register ASAP so we can get a feel for how many people to expect. Next Thursday, our CTO Innovation Circle is going to approach the topic of the social and economic implications of the metaverse. This will be part 1 of 2. Excited to have this event, so please join us. On the 23rd of March, we will have another California ACG e-lunch. If you haven't attended those, great opportunity to network with ACG members from across California and beyond. Many more events to follow, so please visit our website, acgsv.org, to see the full calendar of what we have in store for you. Now, for today's panel discussion, I would like to thank our M&A Circle sponsors, Reed Smith and RSM. Without their continued support, we couldn't do what we do, so thank you. Let me introduce you to our moderator, Craig Lilly from Reed Smith. He is a leading legal advisor for strategics and private equity clients on domestic and cross-border technology acquisitions, mergers, divestitures, SPACs, recapitalizations, leveraged buyouts, and minority investments. That's a mouthful. This includes advising emerging technology companies on venture capital financings, corporate governance matters, and public offerings. Craig also represents fund sponsors in connection with structuring and organizing investment funds, parallel investment vehicles, and offshore funds. Now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Craig so he can get us started. Craig.
Great, thanks, Yvonne. We're very excited about our M&A circle here regarding international M&A gotchas, CFIUS anti-corruption journey, and more. First, I'd like to introduce Michael Loeb. He is a partner at Reed Smith, and he heads Reed Smith's global regulatory and investigations practice, where he manages over 90 attorneys across the globe on regulatory and government enforcement matters. Mike has been recognized by both Chambers USA and Chambers Global and Legal 500 as in his work as an expert in export controls and economic sanctions, as well as CFIUS and corporate crime and investigations. Michael represents both large multinationals, PE firms, and financial institutions, and in a wide variety of cross-border issues. Thank you, Michael, and we're glad to have you here for the event today.
Thank you, Craig. I'm looking forward to it.
Next, I'd like to introduce Jan Robertson. Jan is a managing partner and co-founder of CFIUS Advisors, and mergers and acquisition investment banking firm that specializes in representing mid-sized technology companies ranging from 20 to 250 million on selling and merging their businesses. Jan is a 30-year plus M&A professional. She previously was also at RBC Capital Markets and New York-based Needham & Company, where she led their Silicon Valley M&A practice on Sand Hill Road from 1997 to 2002. She co-founded CFIUS Advisors in late 2002 at the invitation of a client, and together they have grown the firm to include Boston in addition to Silicon Valley, with connections around the globe. Jan also has been named previously as one of Silicon Valley's top 100 women of influence. Thank you, Jan, for joining us today.
Thank you, Craig.
Well, I'll start with Mike. Obviously, there's a lot going on with the Russian sanctions, really a pertinent timing for our event today. Mike, I thought maybe you could just kind of discuss generally the Russian sanctions and how that's impacting U.S. businesses as well as M&A generally.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Craig. I know we weren't planning to talk about sanctions when we planned this meeting, but as Craig and Jan and Yvonne and I were chatting before the event, it felt like it might be the elephant in the room if we didn't at least acknowledge it. And of course, we're not going to turn this into a session on Russia sanctions, but I'll just maybe say a few words, and then if any of our participants have questions, we'd be happy to try to address them. So the implications of the sanctions have been actually tremendous, affecting businesses across the spectrum, everybody from goods and services to suppliers to banks to investors, and virtually any type of company that you can imagine. We've been really inundated over the last several days with clients of all shapes and sizes trying to deal with these issues. So just to sort of level set on where we are, we've really seen the US in close coordination with the UK, Europe, Switzerland, Singapore, Japan, Australia, and others implement what appears to be the full package of sanctions that were planned or discussed as part of the planning back earlier this year. So we have everything from asset freezes, which in the United States we would call specially designated national. That can affect investors in a wide variety of ways. So in essence, when you have an asset freeze, any property or interest in property of the target of the sanction becomes frozen. So what we've seen in the past, when a Russian oligarch has been sanctioned, for example, would be, we find that the Russian oligarch has investments in the United States, and co-investors, other partners in the investment will now have a sanctioned party where they'll have to set up a special account to hold profits, and they'll have to obtain government authorization to take certain steps with respect to the activity. I think in one of the most challenging cases we saw, it was real estate, real property in the United States that was used as rental units near a university where a Russian oligarch owned an interest. And we had to go to OFAC to get licenses to make any kind of capital investment in the property. We had to get licenses to be able to have leases for the students who were renting the property. So if you have an investment with one of these SDN targets, it's a significant impact on sort of your day-to-day operations. That's really the most meaningful of the sanctions that we have. The other sorts of sanctions that we have, obviously, sanctions on the Russian banks, and there's a mix of them. There's asset freezes, there's prohibitions on trading in debt and equity, there's prohibitions on U.S. correspondent banking, and sort of at this point we've sort of hit all of the major Russian financial institutions. The implications of that are creating tremendous practical difficulties for companies and organizations who are continuing to do lawful business in Russia. So you can imagine, for example, the challenge that it presents if you have, like one of our clients has a recently concluded transaction where the target had a Russian subsidiary, and now they're trying to sort out very quickly what can we do with this Russian subsidiary from all of the variety of different perspectives, everything from EHG considerations to obviously most importantly the health, safety, and welfare of the employees of the organization, to how can they leverage technology, what does the supply chain look like if we're dependent on a Russian supplier, et cetera. And then I think the last category I would mention, and obviously as I said, this is really a high level treatment, is around export controls. That's going to be the most meaningful impact in the long run. We have pretty significant changes to US law in the form of what are called foreign direct product rules. And the basic rule is that, or the practical implication of the rule is that US technology and software that has been licensed out to companies in China or elsewhere around the world in order to manufacture product, the results of that technology is now controlled under US law for transfer to Russia in many cases. So this is creating sort of an enormous impact really across the globe in countries that don't directly touch Russia, and in business that doesn't directly touch Russia. And that Obviously, we've seen that come up in the investment context. We sort of heard rumors that this was going to be one of the components of the sanctions. This was these foreign direct product rules were the key tool that the U.S. government used when it was pressuring Huawei, for example. So it wasn't a total surprise that they went this route, but the implications of it are pretty tremendous. It's essentially cutting off Russia from tech and others parts and components that it needs from the United States indirectly in order to conduct its business. So I think I'll wrap it there, Craig. So that's may have been too much already, but yeah, just a lot of activity and a lot of legal, practical, ethical, and health and security issues for all involved.
Thank you, Michael. Jan, I know you work with a lot of technology companies on the front initially planning for M&A and how to avoid pre-deal gotchas and mistakes. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, but also, feel free to talk about how you feel the Russian sanctions may, impact companies and potential sellers, in the technology area and otherwise.
Sure. Thanks, Craig. Fascinating, Michael. I appreciated your summary on the sanctions. That was really, very insightful. Yeah, we, first of all, with the market, and I was telling Craig earlier that we're actually taking one of our client companies to market today. And traditionally, we do a full worldwide canvas when we're representing our mid-sized clients and seeking buyers from all over the world. I will say that we've certainly done deals with Asian companies and also Western Europe and Australia and New Zealand, and we have not sold a company to Russian buyers. So hopefully it won't affect our perspective and our marketing efforts and our ability to close deals. However, what concerns us is how the sentiment, the uncertainty in the world, the big question looming is how far will Putin go? And the uncertainty rippling through the financial markets and how that impacts buyers' appetites, both strategic buyers, i.e. buyers that are in the industry, the specific industry of the companies we're selling, be that software, technology, or other types of industrial or healthcare businesses. And so we very much watch what the sentiment is and the tone of the market. And I was heartened this morning that the market, at least last time I looked, appeared to be up. And whether or not that was the State of the Union address last night and reassurances that Western allies are coming together to try to halt Putin's ambitions, or what is causing that. But at least the market was showing some positive signs today, albeit the NASDAQ in any event was down about 12.5%, 13% since the beginning of the year. So that's been a concern recently. In terms of how we prepare companies to go to market, we have a huge list of due diligence that we prepare in advance, and particularly financial due diligence, because most buyers are making their decisions not only based on strategic fit, but also on how to value the business, what the forecasts look like, how profitable it is, how it compares to other companies in the industry. And we know from experience that it's very much, the financial people within both the private equity and the strategic buying organizations that will very, very carefully scrutinize and put a valuation on the businesses. So we make sure that our client is well prepared on a line-by-line basis to answer, all of these types of due diligence and capital expenditures and growth and all those questions. So we try to head off most of those potential deal gotchas, but having been doing this 30 plus years, every deal has its challenging twists and turns. So you can't always head off all of those. And that's probably enough for now, Craig. I'm happy to expound or answer any questions.
Well, Jan, thank you very much. I thought we might just turn to the conversation, talk about the Committee on Foreign Investment US and the regulations, just to give everyone a little bit of a primer on that. I thought, Michael, maybe you could talk a little bit about when does CFIUS apply, and then also how does a company prepare for potential CFIUS review as well?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Craig. So just basically on when CFIUS applies. So we still have, and I think most of our participants on this call likely know that the laws have changed in recent years. We still have historical CFIUS jurisdiction, which means that the CFIUS, which is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, is a committee of about 13 agencies that sit together to review transactions and chaired by the Treasury Department. CFIUS has jurisdiction to review any foreign person's acquisition of a U.S. business. And foreign person in this context is going to include the ultimate parent company or shareholder that sits on top of an organization. We get that question very often. It's a common mistake. So, for example, if the U.S. subsidiary of a French multinational purchases another U.S. business, even though the direct transaction is U.S. and U.S., that is going to be within CFIUS jurisdiction. So that's their jurisdiction. They have authorization to review any transaction that fits within that jurisdiction, and any party to a transaction who desires to have a CFIUS review can voluntarily bring the transaction to CFIUS and have it reviewed in advance. If we look at it historically, CFIUS exists to try to balance both U.S. national security concerns and an interest in protecting U.S. technology and infrastructure, as well as the strong U.S. policy to encourage foreign investment. What we've seen in recent years is an expansion beyond that to provide for mandatory CFIUS reviews in certain situations. And those have greatly expanded sort of what our CFIUS practice looks like and how it affects the investors. So we have mandatory CFIUS filings in essence, two contexts. And it depends on who is the target of the investment, and it depends on who is the investor. So the term that we use now, it's defined in the law and the regulations, is whether or not the target of the investment is a US TID business. That's an acronym. The T stands for technology, the I stands for critical infrastructure, and the D stands for personal data. So the first question that we have when we look at a transaction, and we do this work both pre and post transaction and during the transaction in support of trying to achieve closure. The first question we ask is the US target of the investment a TID business? And that really becomes sort of a key determinative factor. If the target is a TID business, then there's two angles upon which you have a mandatory filing. You have to go through the CFIUS process before you can complete the transaction. The first is if the US party is engaged in critical technology, producing, designing, developing what's called critical technology. And that critical technology aligns pretty closely to our export control rules. So do they have export controlled technology, software, or items? If they do, and a license would be required for the home country of the foreign investor, then a CFIUS review is required. So you have the critical technologies test. The second angle by which you can have a mandatory filing is if you have a TID US business and you have a foreign investor that is substantially owned by a foreign government, with some limited exclusions for the UK, Canada, for example. Foreign investor coming in, buying a US company that is TID business because it has more than 1 million information on more than 1 million Americans, personal data on more than 1 million Americans, would be subject to a mandatory CFIUS filing review. So that's been one aspect of the key development on CFIUS. The second aspect is to require CFIUS review or CFIUS jurisdiction over investments in US TID businesses that provide the foreign investor with certain rights with respect to the investment. So board seats, observer rights, and involvement in decision making, or the most difficult one, which has been access to material non-public technical information. So if essentially what they're trying to do is cut off the possibility of a foreign investor using a minority investment in a US business to obtain access to technology, information, or influence that the US government may have some national security concerns about. So those are sort of the big two developments in the United States. I should mention that the biggest sort of development in the foreign investment realm or practice area are new UK mandatory filing rules, which track the US in large part, but are actually slightly more expansive. So we've had a few deals already this year where we've done our analysis of foreign investment requirements, concluded that no filing is necessary in the United States, but a filing is necessary in the UK. And the difficulty of that is in the United States, CFIUS has become quite sophisticated, well-staffed, and resourced over the last few years, and they've become very predictable in terms of results, in terms of timing, et cetera. The UK, they're just now figuring it out. The new rules became effective in January, and it's all new for them. So we're anticipating some delays, questions, disruptions possible on the UK investment side. We've seen similar developments in China. They've adopted a new rules on foreign investment controls. We have, Greg, we have some partners at our firm who are focused on those issues. And as with other legal issues in China, the real challenge in those requirements is that they're vague, and it's very difficult to get clear guidance from the Chinese government on how exactly they apply to the transaction. What we're seeing so far is that the standard in the review looks like something like Chinese officials basically saying they know if they're concerned when they see it. So come tell us about your transaction. We'll tell you whether or not we're concerned. So that's a big challenge. Now, on the second part of your question, Craig, as is likely evident from the description, with the key point being whether or not the target is a TID business, there is some clear planning that can be done in advance to try to try to make these transactions run smoother and try to mitigate some of the CFIUS related risk. We're basically seeing two avenues of approach. The first is for companies or organizations in the United States who are looking to raise capital, or maybe looking to raise capital in the future, or perhaps to be acquired in the future, to do that TID business analysis now, so they understand how the rules are applied, and so that the deal can be structured to prevent mandatory CFIUS filing if that's what's necessary, or to address what are likely to be the national security concerns if CFIUS is ultimately going to have jurisdiction. So if you are in the US on the side of looking to raise capital, you're focused on what can I do to understand and mitigate risk associated with being a TID business. And there's a variety of things within that you can do. For foreign investors, or for those working with foreign investors, there is a clear strategy that has emerged as a best practice for frequent investors in the United States who are foreign. And that is proactive outreach to CFIUS to build a pre-existing relationship and to talk as candidly as possible about where their issues or concerns may lie. We are seeing that that's emerged really over the last 18 months. I can't name names, obviously, but I would say some of the most sophisticated foreign investors are taking that to heart and making that part of their routine plan. So proactively meeting with the committee to introduce themselves when they do not have a deal in front of them, telling them about their organization, what their goals and intentions are in the U.S. market. And then when the transactions arise, there's already that familiarity, the relationships between executives within the organization and legal advisors within the organization, and those decision makers and facilitators within CFIUS. So that's really the clear strategy to try to mitigate CFIUS related risks. I hope that was helpful, Craig.
Oh, no, that's very helpful. Yeah, thank you. There's a lot of information there to digest there, but Mike, I thought that was very helpful. Jan, I guess one thing I'd like to ask you is you deal with or work with a lot of sellers in preparation for both foreign and domestic buyers, whether those could be private equity funds or strategics. How does the preparation different if you're preparing to sell to a strategic or a private equity buyer?
Thanks, Greg. I think one of the interesting things, just to talk a little bit about private equity buyers, over the years, we have seen private equity normally seeking profitable companies. And in fact, if we were representing a high growth, typical Silicon Valley company where the revenues were growing, but the profits were not in what we would call private equity interesting territory, then we would most often exclude private equity. And we would simply prepare a deck that focused on the technology and what the fit might be tailored to each specific category of strategic buyers. So that's how traditionally we would approach marketing and positioning, showcasing in the sale, companies like that. Recently, I would say over the past 5 years, we have seen an interesting subclass of private equity or financial sponsors that will focus on growth software companies and are not so concerned about profits, but will focus on how the strategic fit might be with other platform investments in their portfolio. So what we found when we're targeting those types of private equity is that we can use, pretty much the same deck as for strategics, and position it more as a strategic sale with that type of private equity. So that's kind of one way in which private equity has changed and segmented itself. And we're seeing many more of these emerging funds. What's been interesting to us is a number of these growth funds are out of Canada, as well as across the U.S. And they're always contacting us, so we have a pretty good database of who these are. The other thing we do with private equity is we make sure that if we are contacting a type of private equity, we make sure that they have something in their portfolio that is related to the company we're selling. The last thing we want to do is have to educate the private equity on the industry of the company we're selling. No one has time for that these days, and that's not a particularly great way to drive value for the sale of our client companies. So those are some of the slightly different ways that we prepare and we position the companies for sale with different classes, private equity and also strategics. Clearly, my earlier remarks about the importance of us doing our due diligence and detailed financial preparation, making sure the financials really stand up to scrutiny and the forecasts are sanity checked, which is very, very important. And so that kind of preparation is universal and is common to both asset classes. And I guess one last comment on private equity. In preparing for this panel and also another panel I'm doing this evening and a talk I'm doing this evening, I was quite surprised that last year globally, of the $6 trillion worth of M&A transactions that happened globally in 2021, an all-time record, fully 36% of those were backed by the broader category of financial sponsors, which includes sovereign wealth funds and others, but is primarily private equity and late stage venture. And that number, that 36%, has increased from low 30s, about 30% previous year, and then in sort of the mid 20s in previous years. And so we're really seeing private equity coming on strongly. And just one last anecdotal, interesting comment in terms of big deals. An example is Thoma Bravo, which is clearly one of the huge private equity players. They did 3 large software transactions last year, multi-billion, including acquiring a Santa Barbara company here in the, I think it was the employee engagement space for a couple of $2 billion. So Thoma Bravo has emerged really more as a strategic, but definitely big private equity.
Yeah, I read recently that the 5 largest private equity funds have over $2 trillion in assets under management. And Blackstone alone has over 800 billion in assets under management. So definitely in the heyday of private equity right now. Jan, as a follow-up question, I'm just curious, how are some of the ways you've seen deals have gone awry, not only during pre-closing negotiations, but post-closing as well?
I will say that we see a lot more in the pre-closing because the role of the M&A investment banker is typically over with once closing occurs. Although there are often residuals where we may have a delayed payment of some sort, based on a performance or a contingency payment. And so afterwards, it can, the most often reason it goes awry is because there are problems with the contingency and the performance payments. But pre-closing, I would say the number of things that can go awry, the list is endless. And we talk about good preparation and the sorts of things in our due diligence, as much as we can in advance and prepping the management team, and that includes rehearsing for interviews with buyers. For instance, the deal we're taking to market today, we spent 3 months preparing. Now, part of that is that the client took a while to get their financials together and to make them pass muster. But, once we're in the marketplace, one of the big challenges is if the shareholders aren't aligned, and we see this not only with family businesses, but we've seen it with where there's a number of partners who own the business. And if control is not clearly in the hands of one individual, sometimes there are disagreements when it comes to when the offers come in and who they want to deal with and how they feel about the price. And so we spend a lot of work in advance trying to make sure that the management team is aligned. Now, I will tell you that with family businesses, it's often a lot more challenging to ensure they're aligned. But it occurs where there's one of the biggest challenges we had, and this was last year, was there was a very significant, not a controlling shareholder, but a significant, 40% corporate shareholder that had put money into the deal early on that helped the company grow, but then decided they didn't want to acquire it, that their overall strategy had gone in a different direction. But when it came to the offers, one of the best offers was from one of their big competitors, and AKA the evil empire. And at first they were on the do not call list. And then, you know, they kept flip-flopping whether or not we could contact them. When we finally did, it was a knockout over the top valuation bid that came in. And then we had, there were a lot of motions to deal with, and it was a large company, shareholder owned by an individual, but private company. But anyway, really personal relationships ended up sort of smoothing the waters. The CEO of our client company helped smooth the waters with the original big shareholder, and sanity prevailed in the end, and we closed the deal successfully. But it was a nail biter for a while because of the different, you know, competitive forces at will. So there are all kinds of things that can go wrong, but I think misalignment of shareholders is one thing. And, you know, when the rubber hits the road and the bids come in, sometimes when people are previously aligned, you can see dissension happening. And I won't get into too many family business stories, but for every family business we take on, there's usually some sort of dissension among the ranks, parents to children, husbands and wives. We have a husband-wife situation right now that's get fascinating insights into people's marriages. So anyway, the list of gotchas, I could probably talk all afternoon about gotchas, but that's perhaps enough for now.
Thank you, Jan. You know, common gotchas we see a lot of times are just sloppy capitalization. You can't determine who owns the company. We've seen a lot of sloppy tax reporting and tax compliance. Obviously, IP is big for tech buyers, and we've had several deals where we can't confirm that the company owns the IP. So those are all major issues, if not deal killers too, as well.
Yeah.
Structure.
Just a follow-up comment on that. When you talk about tax issues, one of the big things we see, unfortunately, is tax fraud. And companies that, particularly private companies, often family businesses, that have been putting through a lot of personal expenses and commingling expenses with the business. And last year, there was quite an egregious case of that, and that had to all be cleaned up before we could take the company to market. So tax fraud is something, sadly, that we see quite a bit. And I was going to make another comment. Oh, IP. We have a situation right now. This is a brand new engagement, and it is a large industry association. I won't say what industry, but they are not a tech industry, but they have built a software platform that evaluates supply chain in their industry. And it's become about a $200 million company. And that company is now going off raising capital and going to do an IPO, but the technology is still owned by the industry association. And we're hired on behalf of the industry association to help sort of look out for their interests in these, transactions that are happening. And, part of it is making sure that the rights to the IP, the licensing, all of that is cleaned up. And it's very clear, where the ownership is, and that they're properly compensated for that in the transactions that are happening.
Well, thank you, Jan. Michael, as an expert in regulatory compliance, what are some of the key areas of concern in the diligence context that companies should be aware of in preparation for a transaction?
Yeah, I was hoping you were going to ask Craig, because I wanted to pick up on something that Jan said. I think Jan hit it right on the nail on the head. So I get involved in transactions pre-transaction, when a transaction is just being contemplated. During the transaction, as due diligence regulatory counsel on probably 50 to 100 deals every year, and then As you had mentioned at the outset, Craig, I do a lot of investigative and enforcement work as well. And that's always post-transaction, unfortunately. You close the deal and then you figure out there's a problem there, a problem surfaces. And sometimes the problem surfaces during the due diligence. And we see it and you know it's coming and you adjust value accordingly. But that's really where sort of the core of the work is for these 90 attorneys that are part of our practice group. It's post-transaction, something that emerged during due diligence or shortly after closing that presents a major issue. But I wanted to pick up on Jan's point around tax fraud, because Craig, when we were talking about, sort of key due diligence issues and what do we get concerned about and what are the issues that we worry about when we're reviewing a transaction, it really dovetails nicely with Jan's comment around tax fraud. The issue that and where, so the first thing I'm doing when I get on a deal, if it's a U.S. business that moves goods or materials, the first thing I'm doing is looking at exposure to Chinese imports and the U.S. tariffs and classification requirements, duties and tariffs. So it dovetails perfectly with what Jan said about tax fraud. It's a type of tax fraud, but it's so technical and so difficult, and so far down in the weeds that ordinary due diligence, if you're not looking for this issue, is unlikely to surface it. But to give you an example of skill, we have a client that we're working with now, a huge PE fund. They purchased a medium-sized US company that imports most of the products that it sells from China. They have 2 product lines. As many of you may know, during the Trump administration, we imposed tariffs on imports of certain items from Russia. And the way they determine the tariffs is by looking at the value, whether or not the tariff applies to the amount of the tariff. They look at what is the item that's being imported. That right there, that we call that classification. That's like a complex, nuanced thing. You usually have a customs broker do it or some sort of engineer do it. It never rises. It's never something that a corporate deal team is going to look at. Is their customs classifications correct? And then the second thing is around the value of the imported goods. If the value matches commercial invoices, et cetera, ordinary due diligence is not going to spot an issue. But we're really seeing 2 things, particularly in smaller businesses. And one of them, which is relevant to this large PE fund. If the US company had a huge exposure to Chinese imports and they have the classification code wrong, and to give you an idea, when we say down in the weeds, classification code is 12 digits. If they've got 2 or 1 or 2 of those digits incorrect, you might have a duty of 2% and no tariff. But if they had the correct code, you have a duty of 20% and a 25% tariff. So if you have a business where their key product line is revenue off of sales of imported products, and you learn that the margin you thought you had was 45%, has now become 2% once you do the proper adjustment of the customs tariffs, you've destroyed all of the value of the deal. It's erased. You bought a business that wasn't viable, and you have a tax fraud. You have a historical liability now for the customs, for the duties and tariffs. So that's the issue that I'm going to first if I see a U.S. business that's importing from China. What's the level of exposure? Do they have a customs compliance program? Or do we have potentially an impact on the future value of the business and EBITDA? And do we have a historical tax liability associated with that? Very difficult to detect, particularly if you don't go specifically looking at that issue. The second issue that I look at, and the one that presents in most cases the greatest risk, the greatest sort of regulatory risk under U.S. law, is going to be around relationships with third parties. So that's where you bring in FCPA risks, risks associated with export controls and sanctions and supply chain and human slavery and a lot of EHG considerations, et cetera. So we're looking for, do they have written contracts with all of their third parties? Or those contracts have appropriate terms that mitigate the risk? Do they have systems, processes, controls in place, and auditing oversights to ensure that they're managing compliance in the context of those third-party relationships? Without question, I would say 50% or more of the work that our practice group does on the enforcement context arises out of the conduct of a third party to a US or European or Asian multinational. Sales reps, distributors, resellers, sales consultants, other sort of agents and representatives operating around the world. So that as a focus area, if you could only look at two things in a deal from a due diligence, from a regulatory due diligence perspective, it would be those two. What is their exposure on essentially the tax issue on tariffs and duties, and how does this company manage its third parties? What's the exposure there for the conduct of third parties?
Hey, Mike, if there's, compliance gaps regarding like FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act type of compliance, what type of things have you seen clients do to proactively protect them? I mean, have they ever gone in the weeds and actually require a lot of their employees to sign updated compliance certificates and things like that? Or I was curious what types of things you've done other than, having a full, financial audit of transactions as well.
Yeah, great question. So certainly we have seen clients look for certifications from, on the buy side, you might look to certifications from the current owners, certifications from business leaders across the organization, coupled with due diligence to understand sort of what the state of the contracts and these relationships are. That's one sort of approach. Another approach we've seen is during the transaction period, requiring the target of the investment to essentially clean up the issue. So we have seen investors, go to the target and say, if we're going to close in 2 months, you need to amend all of these contracts to have all of these terms and conditions, and you need to terminate any contract that's not based on one of these by X date. And I even had one case where they required them to do that sort of contract overhaul and to monitor how the business did in the immediate aftermath of that contract overhaul. And then post acquisition, if you don't have the opportunity to do that sort of due diligence, there are strategies that can be deployed to sort of stop the continuation of issues. I mean, one of the key risks in the wake of a transaction is you're already going to inherit the liability in most cases under the FCPA and other laws when you close the transaction. But the day that transaction closes, if you're not aware of a course of conduct that violates the laws, they start to become your violations for which you may face aggravated penalties. So prompt post-closing audits, assessments, et cetera, by trade compliance and legal and compliance resources within the company can pay great dividends in that regard. And depending on the results, that you have opportunities to consider voluntary disclosure or trying to get pull back money or equity from the sellers.
Thank you, Michael. Jan, I was just curious, you're talking generally about pitfalls that you've seen in the M&A process. Are there any like technology specific or industry specific ones that you see across, in your deal making? I'm just curious.
I think as far as technology goes, there's sometimes a lack of clarity in terms of the IP ownership is probably probably the biggest one. And then coupled with that is IP that has not been properly protected with patents and secured. And I think those are a couple of the biggest questions that we see. The other is from a software specific point of view, and this is broader than IP, but it's the stickiness of the customer base and properly calculating churn rates. And this has become one of the big issues in one of our current deals is different buyers, particularly buyers internationally, will calculate there's gross churn, net churn, and really testing the sanity of the business model. And while the IP may be very robust, and how the customers are using it is very well received, but depending on how the churn rates are calculated, the stickiness of the business and whether the business is just sort of continually changing over into new customers coming in, and while the aggregate number of customers remains the same, the the enterprise level or how the quality of the customer base is something that is very hard to audit, and it's where buyers spend a lot of time delving into trying to understand what is the quality of the solution and how is it being implemented, and also growing in the marketplace, or is that growth illusory? So I think analyzing that and really coming to grips with that on the part of the buyers, clearly we do our best from due diligence in advance, but when the buyers come looking, depending on where the buyers are in the world and how they calculate these types of growth and churn rates, you can get into a lot of different arguments. So I think those are probably the two biggest things around the technology and the adoption of the technology that we've seen in recent times that has been sort of top of the mind issues.
Thank you, Jan. We only have a few minutes left, so I thought maybe I'd leave it to each of you, just kind of ask you for, here in 2022, what do you think are going to be some of the key trends or issues for companies in cross-border M&A that they should, that everyone should be concerned about, and maybe any forecasts you have as well? I'd be curious to hear that. Michael, I'll start with you.
Okay. Yeah, that's a tough question. Hey, Craig, you were supposed to give us the questions in advance.
Spontaneity.
I thought that was a lot there, open-ended.
Well, it's going to be really interesting to see what the implications are of the steps that the U.S. and others are taking now with respect to Russia, because we have seen in the past when the U.S. Leverages its unique role in the international financial system, whether it's cutting companies off from SWIFT or countries off from SWIFT, et cetera, like they've done with Iran, there is a reaction to that, right, that exists outside the United States that concerns the Chinese, that concerns Chinese vulnerabilities to having similar controls. Obviously, now the Russians will be looking for alternatives. So, I mean, if we go to like biggest picture, the dominance of the US dollar, the dominance of the US financial institutions in global trade, I'm not predicting its demise in any way, but it is going to face challenges this year that are real because of all of these events that are happening. From a due diligence perspective, I think a clear trend on the CFIUS side is foreign investors having a preference to voluntarily engage with CFIUS and to address CFIUS risks on the front end. That seems to be growing. And if we look, it's anecdotal because I'm one lawyer at one law firm, but if I look at the deals that we're working over the last 6 to 9 months under the Biden administration, there's been a clear, strong preference by foreign investors to voluntarily engage with CFIUS, and that means deals need to be planned accordingly in terms of the timeline to close. U.S. companies looking to complete a strategic transaction of that type, thinking about timing considerations associated with it. And then I guess the last thing I'd mention is sort of related to all of this is I think it's pretty clear we're going to see a proactive CFIUS review of potential Russian investment in the United States that looks and feels similar to what we've seen CFIUS do with respect to existing Chinese investment over the last several years. So I think we'll continue to see a trend of closed investments or closed transactions being reconsidered if they have a nexus to Russians.
Great, thanks, Michael. Jan, do you have any thoughts on that or forecasts or trends you see in 2022?
Yeah, sure. And, I think my remarks are slanted towards tech because that's, the main sector we focus on, but I would divide it into 2 areas. First of all, let's talk on the positive side about the deal drivers. And I think the strategic need for innovation and technology and growth, adding platform investments as well as, filling gaps in technology in bigger companies. I think that's going to continue to grow. And, I think the race towards, being at the forefront of technology, I think that will continue. I mean, I thought it was fascinating this year. I mean, in January, one of the biggest deals Microsoft has done is acquiring really the building blocks for the metaverse of Activision Blizzard, a $69 billion deal. Now, whether that's because they saw what Facebook is doing with the metaverse, not so sure, but the race continues. I think tax considerations and hopefully continued attractive valuations will continue to drive deals, exits for privately held companies where everyone is afraid of potential tax increases. It didn't happen this year in a major way, but that's still lurking out there, and capital gains tax. So I think sellers and retiring baby boomers owning businesses, they will continue to rush to the market. And I think rates in historical context, despite the Fed's planned increases for 2022, I think rates really are relatively low in historical context. There's nothing like announced rate increases to spook and spur buyers into action and sellers. Now on the headwinds or on the negative side, absolutely echoing geopolitical upheaval. How far will Russia go, and to what extent will NATO and allies in the West push back to stop the spread? Will it spread beyond Ukraine, and then what are the implications? I mean, some dark thoughts there potentially. And I think COVID-19, there's always the wild card of whether we're going to see new variants. Omicron ended up being perhaps a little less virulent than folks had feared, but nonetheless, this is not over yet. And I think market gyrations, of course, and lastly, supply chain disruptions. And that is continuing to affect businesses worldwide, and it's permeating every industry, and it's actually spurring a lot of software acquisitions that deal with logistics and supply chain, which was one of the most active subsectors of software in this past year. So anyway, that is kind of a quick overview of what we see for potentially 2022.
Jan, those are all great points. Yeah, one of the things I read today also in Wall Street Journal as far as some of the implications of this too, what's happening today is there's some concern that China is going to try to decouple more from their reliance on the dollar, US dollar as well, which could have some more geopolitical implications as well, and financial implications.
I think that's been happening, you know, in the past few years in anticipation. I think Huawei, the whole situation with that, you know, spurred China into action. And, you know, I think, you know, we're starting to see Russia and China, of course, cozying up, becoming best buds. You know, you support my war, I'll support your war. And I think we know what China wants to do vis-a-vis Taiwan. But anyway, we'll see.
All right. Well, sounds good. Thank you for everyone. This has been a wonderful discussion. We'll have to do some follow-up discussion too as well. It's been a great event. So thank you, Jan and Michael, for your time. Yvonne, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts as well.
I don't, but it was very interesting to hear Jan and Michael's points. I think he had to sign off.
Hi, Michael.
Very quick. But wanted to thank you, Jan. I'll thank Michael later. Craig, thank you so much for moderating and keeping us on our toes here. I hope everybody enjoyed the discussion. Come join us for another event. We'd love to see you. Happy hour on 3/24. Please come. And otherwise, have a wonderful day.
Yes, thank you everyone for attending. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks, Yvonne.